Hi guys, tonight we'll drift gently into the story of a woman whose calm imagination turned death into beauty and crime into poetry. This is the life of Agatha Christie, the quiet soul who painted murder not with fear, but with elegance. She became the best-selling novelist of all time, yet she spent her days in silence, often alone, listening to the whispers of her mind. Let's begin this journey slowly, as if we're turning the first page of a well-worn book in the soft light of evening. But before we begin, for those who enjoy slow, thoughtful stories about legendary figures, hit like, subscribe and share in the comments which personality or historical figure you'd like me to cover next. And tell me, where are you watching from? I'm always curious to see the different places my viewers are from. Agatha Mary Clarissa Miller was born on a cold September morning in 1890 in the seaside town of Torquay, England. Her home faced the sea, and from her earliest memories she spoke of the sound of the waves as if they were alive, speaking to her in a secret language only she understood. Her father, Frederick, was a gentle American who adored comfort and quiet conversation. Her mother, Clara, believed children should not learn to read until they were 8. Yet Agatha, full of curiosity, taught herself by the age of 4. Books became her silent companions, and stories her secret friends. Childhood for Agatha was both dreamlike and lonely. She was the youngest of 3, often left to wander through the gardens, talking to herself, inventing imaginary friends and strange adventures. The grand Victorian rooms of her home were filled with antique furniture, ticking clocks, and long shadows at sunset. The kind of atmosphere that would later breathe life into her mysteries. But beneath the warmth of home, there was always a sense of stillness, a pause before something unknown. That quiet tension would one day become the essence of her art. Her father's health declined when she was still a girl, and money slowly began to fade from the family's life. Frederick's passing when Agatha was 11 changed her world. She withdrew further inward, finding comfort in solitude and imagination. Her mother encouraged her to write poems and small tales, telling her that one must live twice, once in the world and once in the mind. Agatha took that to heart. In her teenage years, she filled notebooks with stories about lost treasures, mysterious letters, and ghosts that spoke in riddles. She had no formal education beyond a few finishing schools in Paris, where she studied piano and voice. But though she had the talent for music, she lacked the hunger for performance. She was shy, reserved, and happiest when unseen, much like one of her later detectives, who observed the world quietly from the corner of a room. When she returned to England, the world around her was changing. It was the early 1900s, and the soft grace of Victorian life was giving way to the uncertainty of a new century. The smell of the sea, the distant sound of trains, and the quiet rhythm of domestic life became the music of her days. She often said that she loved people, but preferred them at a distance, an idea that explained much of her future work. To her, a dinner table full of guests was not just a social scene, but a potential puzzle. Her imagination had a strange balance, both dark and kind. She never saw murder as horror. To her it was logic gone astray, a riddle waiting to be solved. Years later, she would describe writing about death as tidying up human chaos. But for now, she was just a girl, quietly watching, learning how people lied and smiled at the same time. By her early 20s, Agatha had begun to experiment with longer stories. She sent her first manuscript to several publishers, but no one seemed interested. Her writing was delicate, too quiet, they said, too polite to grip readers. But Agatha didn't stop. She kept a calm persistence, never rushing, never losing faith in her strange inner world. Then came the war, the First World War. It was 1914, and Agatha volunteered as a nurse at a Red Cross hospital in Torquay. Surrounded by the wounded and dying, she found herself observing human nature at its rawest. Fear, hope, guilt, and the small, trembling lies people told to survive. She watched as doctors measured doses of medicine and nurses recorded every symptom. It was there, in that sterile, tragic place, that she discovered her love for precision, for the small details that decide life or death. Working in the hospital dispensary, she learned about poisons, how they worked, how they killed, and how they could be used. Later, she would say this job gave her the foundation for every crime she ever wrote. The quiet act of measuring powders and writing labels became, in her mind, an art form. She wasn't thinking about murder yet, but she was already studying its language. When the war finally ended, Agatha had seen too much of pain to be afraid of it. She had also met a charming young aviator named Archibald Christie. Bold, handsome, and full of energy, he swept her into a whirlwind romance, and they married on Christmas Eve 1914, in the middle of war and uncertainty. But even as she became a wife, a new voice inside her began to whisper, the voice of a storyteller who would soon reshape the world of mystery forever. The years after the war were restless. England was healing, and so was Agatha. She had seen death in its most ordinary form, quiet, medical, inevitable. Perhaps that is why, when she began to write her first detective story, she did not treat murder as violence, but as something almost mathematical. It was 1916 when she sat down at her small desk and began to shape The Mysterious Affair at Styles. The story took place in a country house, among polite people who hid sharp secrets. There was a locked room, a cup of cocoa, and a strange Belgian detective with an egg-shaped head. She called him Hercule Poirot. Agatha based him loosely on the refugees she had met during the war, kind, clever men from Belgium who had lost everything but their dignity. Poirot was different from the detectives she had read about before. He was not cold or distant like Sherlock Holmes. He was precise, vain, and charmingly human. His world was clean and ordered, and when crime entered it, he tidied it up. Writing him felt natural to her, as if he had been waiting quietly in her mind all along. When she finished the manuscript, she sent it to a publisher called the Bodley Head. Months passed with no reply, until one morning a letter arrived. They would publish it, with minor edits. Agatha was calm about the news. She didn't celebrate loudly or call attention to herself. In her diary, she simply wrote, "First book accepted. Rather nice." The Mysterious Affair at Styles came out in 1920. It was a modest success, polite reviews, small sales, but it introduced the world to Poirot and to Agatha's particular rhythm. Readers noticed her balance of gentleness and precision. She never lingered on blood or grief. Instead, she wrote about the human mind, the subtle motives, the quiet lies that bloom into tragedy. In her stories, death was not chaos. It was a question. Over the next few years, she wrote with growing confidence. Poirot returned in new adventures, each one sharper and more intricate than the last. She also began to travel more, following her husband Archibald, whose career in aviation took them from one town to another. Life felt bright, full of promise, love, and small joys. Their daughter, Rosalind, was born in 1919, and Agatha adored her. Yet behind the calm domestic scenes, there was always an undercurrent of unease, a feeling that life could change suddenly, without warning. The 1920s brought her more success. The murder of Roger Ackroyd in 1926 changed everything. It was daring, brilliant, and quietly revolutionary. A story that broke the rules of detective fiction. Critics were divided, some calling it genius, others calling it deceit. But the public adored it. Her name began to appear in newspapers, her books sold faster than she could write them, and Poirot became a household name. Yet at the same time, Agatha's personal life began to fracture. Archibald had grown distant. His career consumed him, and his charm, once thrilling, now felt cold. He had fallen in love with another woman. Agatha sensed it, but refused to believe it. Writing had always been her refuge, but now even her stories felt hollow. In the summer of 1926, her beloved mother Clara died, the one person who had always understood her. Agatha was lost. That winter, something extraordinary happened. On the evening of December 3rd, 1926, Agatha Christie vanished. Her car was found abandoned on a country road near Guildford, headlights still on, a fur coat left behind. For 11 days, no one knew where she was. The newspapers went wild. famous author missing, and thousands joined the search. Even Arthur Conan Doyle offered to help. It was as if one of her own mysteries had come to life. When she was finally discovered, she was staying under another name in a small hotel in Harrogate, seemingly unaware of who she was. The doctors called it a breakdown, exhaustion, trauma, amnesia. Agatha never spoke publicly about it. She simply returned home, quietly, and carried on. That silence would become part of her legend, the mystery within the woman who wrote mysteries. The world tried to guess what had happened to Agatha during those missing days. Some said it was a publicity stunt. Others whispered of despair and betrayal. But Agatha herself refused to explain. She never discussed it with anyone, not even her daughter. It was as if she had locked that part of her life away, leaving the rest of the world to imagine its contents. In truth, something in her had changed. The quiet, obedient woman who had written for approval was gone. What remained was a writer who no longer needed permission. After her disappearance, Agatha divorced Archibald. The separation was painful but strangely freeing. She took long walks by the sea, spent days alone with her thoughts, and wrote. Her words became steadier, her imagination more daring. In 1928, she published The Mystery of the Blue Train, inspired by her journeys across Europe. Though critics were lukewarm, readers devoured it. It was as if they felt her resilience hidden between the lines. That same year, she boarded the Orient Express to travel to Baghdad. The journey changed her life. It was her first encounter with the vast deserts and ancient ruins of the Middle East, and something deep inside her awakened. She described the desert as a place where time stands still and truth feels closer. Surrounded by the dry wind and endless sand, she found peace. She also met archaeologists and explorers, people whose calm precision and curiosity mirrored her own. 2 years later, she met Max Mallowan, a young archaeologist more than a decade younger than her. He was gentle, thoughtful, and fascinated by her mind. They met during an excavation in Ur, where the ancient stones whispered stories older than civilization. Agatha was 40, Max was 26. Yet between them there was no awkwardness, only an easy understanding. When they married in 1930, friends were surprised, but Agatha simply said, "It is a quiet happiness." With Max, she travelled through Syria and Iraq, often joining his digs. While he studied broken pottery and forgotten temples, she sat nearby, writing her novels in a tent or a corner of a small hotel. The noise of typewriter keys mingled with the hum of desert insects. These years were among the calmest of her life. From them came some of her finest stories. Murder on the Orient Express, Death on the Nile, Murder in Mesopotamia. The desert gave her new colours, new mysteries, and new silences. Her marriage to Max was built on mutual respect and gentle companionship. They lived quietly, balancing two worlds, archaeology and fiction. Agatha's fame continued to grow, yet she remained humble, even shy. She once said she liked being famous because it makes travel easier. Beyond that, she wanted little. She preferred to be anonymous in crowds, listening, observing, storing details for later use. The 1930s were golden years for her imagination. She created Miss Marple, an elderly village woman whose sharp eyes missed nothing. Marple was not glamorous, nor heroic, but she was wise. Through her, Agatha gave voice to an older, quieter kind of intelligence. She believed that every small act revealed human nature, and that nothing truly evil was ever ordinary. As the decade closed and war loomed again, Agatha wrote faster, as if trying to preserve a peaceful world before it vanished. She understood fear, but she also believed that even in chaos, order could be restored. Her stories ended not with despair, but with closure. A gentle reassurance that every mystery, no matter how dark, could find its answer. When the Second World War began, Agatha was no longer the uncertain young nurse she once had been. She was a woman of 50, calm, composed, and deeply observant. Once again, she volunteered to work in a hospital dispensary, quietly preparing medicines as bombs fell over London. The work steadied her mind. Surrounded by destruction, she found comfort in small acts of order, labelling bottles, measuring doses, restoring control where chaos reigned outside. It was there that she learned about new poisons and chemicals, details that later slipped naturally into her novels. During the long nights of the Blitz, Agatha often wrote by candlelight. Her house would shake, the windows tremble, and yet she would continue typing, lost in her world of puzzles and calm deduction. She once said that writing during the war was a form of sanity, a way to believe that the world still made sense somewhere, even if only on paper. While others dreamed of escape, she created it for them, story by story. Her most famous works of this period carried that balance of logic and fear. And Then There Were None, published in 1939, became an instant phenomenon. It was darker than her earlier stories. 10 strangers invited to a lonely island, one by one meeting their end according to a nursery rhyme. There was no detective, no tidy solution until the final confession. Readers were fascinated and disturbed. It was Agatha's way of exploring guilt and justice in a world that no longer felt safe. Despite the grimness of war, her marriage to Max remained steady. They moved between England and the Middle East whenever possible, continuing his archaeological work when travel allowed. She adapted easily to the harsh simplicity of camp life, washing clothes in tin bowls, cooking over small fires, typing manuscripts beside crates of artifacts. She once joked that she was happiest with a typewriter in a tent. Her humour was quiet, her resilience even quieter. By the mid-1940s, Agatha had become a national figure, though she never behaved like one. She disliked interviews, rarely attended parties, and refused to speak publicly about her writing process. The work should speak, she would say softly, not the worker. She loved blending into ordinary life, visiting small shops or walking through crowded streets unnoticed. It was in anonymity that she observed humanity best. The nervous hands, the shifting eyes, the tone that betrayed a lie. After the war, peace returned, but Agatha knew the world had changed. People had seen too much death to find it thrilling, so she began to focus more on motive, psychology, and quiet tension rather than spectacle. Her later books were gentler, wiser, more reflective. She seemed to understand that evil was rarely monstrous. It was tired, lonely, sometimes even polite, and she treated it with the same grace she had shown her characters from the beginning, with curiosity, not judgment. The post-war years brought Agatha a peace she had long earned. England was rebuilding itself, and she too was rebuilding the quiet rhythms of her life. Fame surrounded her like soft fog, constant, yet never something she sought. Her name appeared everywhere, but she continued to live simply, dividing her time between her London home and her beloved Greenway estate in Devon. Greenway was her sanctuary, an old Georgian house wrapped in ivy, overlooking the River Dart. There she spent long afternoons reading, walking the garden paths, and listening to the birds. "It's the loveliest place in the world," she once said, "and I want to live in it forever." Visitors described Greenway as exactly what one would imagine the home of Agatha Christie to be. Elegant but unpretentious, filled with curiosities from archaeological digs, dusty books, and the faint smell of sea air. She wrote there by the window, watching the river flow past, its stillness reminding her of time's quiet persistence. It was in those years that her tone softened, though her plots remained sharp. Stories like Crooked House and A Murder is Announced carried an understanding of post-war life, how guilt hides behind routine, and how pain lingers in silence. Poirot, her beloved detective, continued his adventures, though even he seemed to age. Agatha often said she imagined him sitting by a fire, fussing over his moustache, reflecting on all the lives he had touched. She respected him deeply, but also felt trapped by his shadow. Readers adored him so much that publishers constantly demanded more, and she feared she would never escape him. To free herself creatively, she began exploring other voices, returning to Miss Marple, whose gentle observation of village life felt like a relief. In Miss Marple, Agatha found a mirror, a reminder that wisdom could come from quiet corners. The old lady's sharp intuition, her patience, her understanding of human frailty, all reflected something Agatha had learned through life. That people rarely change, but their circumstances reveal them. Readers loved Marple's calm insights, and Agatha seemed to find comfort in writing her, as if she too sought rest after decades of constructing intricate puzzles. Despite her success, Agatha remained modest. She preferred talking about Max's archaeological work rather than her books. When asked how she wrote so many novels, she would shrug and say, "By sitting down and writing." Her humour was dry, her discipline absolute. She never romanticised inspiration. She treated writing as work, sacred but simple. And that discipline became her quiet rebellion against the chaos of the world. By the early 1950s, Agatha Christie was no longer just a novelist. She was an institution. Her plays began to conquer the stage, proving that her understanding of suspense could live beyond the page. Yet through it all, she stayed the same gentle observer who once wandered through her garden as a child, listening to the world breathe and turning its smallest secrets into art. When Agatha's play, The Mousetrap, opened in London in 1952, no one could have predicted its destiny. It began modestly, like most of her projects, staged in a small theatre on a foggy November evening. The story: a group of strangers snowed in at a remote guest house, with one of them secretly a murderer, was simple, yet perfectly balanced. Its suspense was quiet, deliberate, built not on shocks, but on human nature. The audience held its breath until the very last scene, when the twist arrived as softly as a sigh. It became an instant success, running night after night, season after season. No one, not even Agatha, imagined it would become the longest-running play in the world. The fame of The Mousetrap didn't change her. She disliked attention and rarely attended openings, claiming she preferred to stay home and bake cakes. Reporters described her as gentle and almost shy, her voice calm and measured, her smile modest. There was no trace of the sensational in her demeanour. She seemed untouched by the thrill of the murder she wrote. To her it was all craft, structure, rhythm, balance. She saw a detective story as a piece of music. Every note, every pause, every reveal had to come at the right time. During the 1950s, Agatha's life moved in a steady rhythm. Summers were spent with Max on archaeological sites across Syria and Iraq. Winters at Greenway or in London, writing and editing. She carried her typewriter everywhere, packed among brushes and pottery shards. Max adored her dedication. He once said that she brought civilization to the desert, not through grand gestures, but through her quiet, organised presence. In camp, she acted as nurse, secretary, cook, and novelist all at once. She even helped catalogue artefacts, applying the same patience she used when arranging clues in her novels. The world, however, began to change around her. New writers were emerging, modern and raw, challenging the classic detective form she had perfected. Agatha observed them with mild curiosity but no resentment. "The world must move on," she once said, "and writers with it. But I have my own corner, and I shall stay there." Her corner, however, was vast. Millions of readers across languages, generations, and continents. By the end of the decade, she had written over 40 novels, countless short stories, and several plays. Her books sold faster than ever, yet she still lived quietly, still preferred small dinners to grand events. When asked the secret of her success, she answered simply, "I have an oddly unromantic view of crime. I think people kill for small reasons: envy, fear, pride, and that makes them interesting." To her, crime was not spectacle, but reflection. It showed the hidden fractures beneath ordinary lives, and in revealing them, she brought order, not horror. At 60, Agatha Christie had already achieved what most writers never dared dream of: immortality in her lifetime. Yet her greatest satisfaction remained the simplest: the joy of shaping a mystery until every piece fit perfectly, and the calm pleasure of watching readers find their way through it. As the 1960s unfolded, Agatha's world grew quieter, though her influence spread wider than ever. Her books were translated into dozens of languages, her plays filled theatres across Europe, and film adaptations began to appear with glamorous stars and sweeping music. Yet she viewed all of it from a distance, almost as if it belonged to someone else. Fame, she once wrote, is pleasant in theory, but rather dull in practice. What mattered to her was the work itself, the delicate construction of story, the satisfaction of the final twist clicking into place. She often said that writing felt like doing a crossword puzzle with the soul. Greenway remained her refuge, her own small paradise untouched by the rush of modern life. She spent hours walking along the riverbanks, her notebook tucked under her arm, jotting down bits of overheard conversation or small details, the way a person stirred tea, the hesitation before a smile. Every tiny gesture fascinated her. "Human beings," she said, "are infinitely peculiar, and I never tire of them." Her characters were built from those fragments, ordinary people who hid extraordinary motives. By now, Poirot and Miss Marple had become symbols of a vanished England. Readers saw in them a comforting certainty, a belief that truth could still be uncovered with patience and logic. Yet Agatha herself had grown older with them. She sometimes complained that Poirot was an insufferable little man, though she admitted he had been good to her. She even began to plan his end, secretly writing his final case years before it would be published. She sealed the manuscript in a safe to be released after her death, a farewell gift to her most loyal creation. Her health began to slow her down, but she remained steady and routine. Mornings were for writing, afternoons for reading or helping Max with correspondence. She was not sentimental, yet deeply attached to her home life, to tea in fine china cups, to the rustle of newspapers, to evenings by the fire. She once said she believed in a comfortable world, where people are kind and mysteries are solved before bedtime. That line captured her perfectly. Calm, orderly, and quietly hopeful. The 1960s also brought a new wave of mystery writers, bolder, more psychological, sometimes violent. Agatha admired some of them but disliked the darkness that seemed to replace curiosity with shock. She never sought to frighten. Her murders were elegant, almost civilized, designed not to disturb but to restore a sense of balance. Evil, she wrote, is only interesting when it is human. She believed that every villain was simply someone whose choices had gone slightly wrong. By the end of the decade, Agatha was the most published author in history, second only to the Bible and Shakespeare. Yet she still felt like a quiet woman with a typewriter, making sense of life one sentence at a time. And though the world around her changed, music, fashion, cities, she remained timeless, much like the puzzles she so gently set before her readers. In her later years, Agatha often reflected on the strange simplicity of her journey. She had never set out to become famous, nor to define a genre. "I wrote," she once said, "because I wanted to see if I could do it well." That quiet motivation never changed, even when her name was printed on millions of covers around the world. Her desk remained modest, cluttered with half-used notebooks and small souvenirs from her travels with Max, a shard of pottery, a dried flower, a faded photograph of a desert sunrise. Each object carried a story, and she treated them like old friends. By the early 1970s, the rhythm of her writing slowed. She was in her 80s now, still lucid, still sharp, though her hands trembled slightly on the keys of her typewriter. Her publishers begged her to rest, but she smiled and said that resting would be worse. She compared writing to breathing, something she might forget how to do if she stopped. Even when words came harder, she shaped them patiently as she always had, slowly, like a gardener pruning her roses. The world adored her. Young readers discovered her books anew. Old ones reread them as comfort. There was something timeless about her tone, polite yet piercing, traditional yet daring. When she received the title of Dame Commander of the British Empire in 1971, she accepted it with quiet grace. She arrived at the palace in a simple dark dress and hat, thanked the Queen softly and went home to tea. Honours to her were pleasant but unnecessary. She had long measured success by the satisfaction of a well-told story. Life with Max remained tender and constant. Though his work still took him to digs abroad, he tried to stay close. They shared a love of quiet evenings, reading by lamplight, discussing history, or sitting in companionable silence. Friends who visited said they seemed perfectly balanced, like two old trees that had grown together over time. Agatha called their marriage a small miracle of patience and affection. In these years, she also became protective of her legacy. She organised her papers, made careful notes about her unpublished manuscripts, and worked with trusted editors to preserve her intentions. She knew her stories would outlive her, and she wanted them to remain untouched, pure in rhythm and tone. The thought comforted her, not pride, but peace. She once wrote that the purpose of art was to tidy up life, just a little, before it untidies you. Yet even in her old age, Agatha retained her humour. When asked how she would like to be remembered, she answered, "As a good cook, perhaps." It was an honest reply. Beneath the legend, she remained a simple woman who loved home, order, and stories that ended neatly. The woman who had turned murder into art without ever losing her tenderness for the world. In the winter of her life, Agatha found beauty in small details. The quiet crackle of a fire, the way frost gathered on her garden bench, the smell of typewriter ink that never quite left her study. She had lived long enough to see the world she once knew fade into history. The England of tea shops, handwritten letters, and polite conversation had given way to airplanes, television, and electric light that never dimmed. Yet she never mourned progress. She accepted it gently, with the same calm she gave to everything. "The world changes," she wrote, "but people do not. That is why stories endure." Her books continued to sell in astonishing numbers. Readers in faraway countries discovered her for the first time, while others passed her novels down like family heirlooms. She would sometimes receive letters from soldiers, teachers, or children who thanked her for helping them escape into mystery when life felt heavy. Those letters moved her deeply. She answered many of them herself in neat, looping handwriting, always beginning with, "Dear reader, how kind of you to write." Though she rarely travelled by then, she and Max occasionally returned to the Middle East when his health allowed. Each trip felt like stepping back into her own imagination. The vast, golden silence of the desert reminded her of the order she always sought in chaos. She often described the desert as her other home, a place where time itself seemed to pause and breathe. Even when she no longer wrote about it, she carried that sense of stillness inside her. In 1974, her memory began to fade. Words that once came easily now hid from her. She would sit at her desk staring at the page, feeling the weight of silence settle around her. It frightened her at first, but then she learned to accept it. "Perhaps," she said quietly to Max, "the stories have gone back to wherever they came from." She continued to edit and reread her earlier work, smiling at the familiar turns of phrase, as if visiting old friends who had grown wiser with time. Even as her strength declined, she insisted on maintaining her routines. Tea at 4, letters in the morning, walks in the garden whenever the weather was kind. Visitors were greeted warmly but briefly. She tired easily and preferred peace to conversation. Her face grew softer, her voice gentler, yet her eyes retained the alertness of someone still watching the world carefully, still taking mental notes. By her mid-80s, she had withdrawn almost completely from public life. The world outside celebrated her endlessly. Tributes, documentaries, stage revivals, film premieres. But she remained in her quiet house by the river, content to let her stories speak for her. She once said she'd written enough to fill a lifetime, and that was precisely what she had done. The final years of Agatha's life unfolded like the closing chapters of one of her novels. Slow, graceful, inevitable. She no longer worried about work or reputation. Both had long taken care of themselves. Her house at Greenway grew quieter each year, filled with the sound of ticking clocks and the faint rustle of river wind through open windows. Visitors often said the place felt timeless, as if the air itself held its breath. In the study, her typewriter sat neatly covered with a folded cloth. Beside it, a vase of fresh flowers always stood, as if waiting for her return. Max remained her constant companion. He read to her when her eyesight weakened, guiding her gently through books she had once known by heart. Sometimes they sat without words for hours, watching the water reflect the shifting light. He was patient, protective, and endlessly kind. To friends, their love seemed unspoken but deep, forged through decades of shared silence and mutual respect. "We are two quiet people," Agatha once said, "and that is enough." Though her memory grew fragile, flashes of clarity still surprised those around her. On certain mornings she would speak vividly of her characters, recalling tiny details no one else remembered. "I always liked Miss Marple's mind," she once told a visitor. "So sharp and yet so gentle." Poirot, too, remained dear to her, even if she had grown tired of his fussiness. "He's been with me too long," she laughed softly. "But he's family." Her family by blood. Her daughter Rosalind and grandson Matthew visited often. They brought warmth and laughter, filling the house with life. Rosalind managed her mother's literary estate with quiet devotion, ensuring her work remained as Agatha intended. To Matthew, she was simply Nima, a grandmother who told stories by the fire and smiled when he guessed the endings too quickly. Those family moments, simple and unrecorded, were her last treasures. In January 1976, as snow fell gently outside Greenway, Agatha Christie passed away in her sleep at the age of 85. There was no drama, no final words of mystery, only peace. England mourned the loss of its most beloved storyteller. Newspapers across the world carried the news, calling her the Queen of Crime, the architect of suspense, the woman who taught the world to read again. But her husband and daughter chose quiet simplicity for her farewell. She was laid to rest near the Church of St. Mary in the small village of Cholsey, surrounded by the countryside she had loved. In the years that followed, her stories continued to live, unchanged, endlessly read, endlessly retold. The mousetrap never stopped playing, and Poirot, true to his nature, made his final bow decades later in print, in the novel she had hidden away. Even in death, she had planned her endings carefully. Agatha Christie had solved the last and greatest mystery: how to turn the ordinary, the tragic, and the fleeting into something eternal. After her passing, Agatha's presence lingered in quiet, unseen ways. Greenway remained exactly as she had left it. Her books neatly stacked, her writing chair angled toward the river, her perfume faintly absorbed into the walls. Max continued to live there for a time, moving carefully through rooms filled with memory. He once said that the house felt as though she might come back at any moment, asking for tea. Visitors who came in later years noticed how alive her spirit still seemed, not ghostly, but calm and watchful, like a whisper in the air. The literary world continued to honour her in ways she would have found both touching and unnecessary. Academics analysed her plots, searching for hidden meaning in her elegant simplicity. Directors adapted her novels into films, giving new faces to Poirot and Miss Marple. Some versions were modern, others timeless, but all carried the same quiet fascination that had made her stories immortal. Audiences filled theatres for every new retelling, eager to step once more into the orderly chaos of her imagination. Her influence spread far beyond the mystery genre. Writers of thrillers, dramas, and even romance cited her as inspiration, not for her themes, but for her craftsmanship. She had proven that complexity could be delivered with grace, and that suspense need not shout to be powerful. Every detective writer who came after her, knowingly or not, walked through the door she had opened. Her structure became the invisible grammar of mystery fiction, the rhythm of question and answer, suspicion and truth. In schools, her books became gateways to literature. Teachers discovered that even reluctant readers, those untouched by poetry or history, could not resist her puzzles. The promise of an answer, of something that would make sense in the end, gave them hope. Libraries across the world stocked her novels on permanent shelves, their spines worn soft by decades of hands. Agatha had achieved what few writers ever could. She had made reading itself an adventure. Max, meanwhile, carried on his archaeological work, though his pace slowed. He never remarried. To colleagues, he often spoke of her with quiet pride, describing her not as the great writer, but as the most observant woman I've ever known. When he died in 1978, he was buried beside her, reuniting them in the same English soil. Two lives intertwined, one digging into the earth to uncover the past, the other digging into the human heart to uncover truth. As the century turned, Agatha Christie's reputation only deepened. Her novels continued to sell by the millions, translated into more than 100 languages. Every few years, new readers discovered her as if for the first time, proving her belief that human nature never changes. She had outlived trends, critics, and generations, not through mystery alone, but through the enduring comfort of her calm, curious gaze. Decades after her death, Agatha Christie's name remains as alive as ever. Her stories continue to circle the world, appearing in new covers, new languages, and new voices. Some are read in quiet classrooms, others are performed on stages from London to Tokyo. The elegance of her puzzles transcends time, untouched by technology or trend. Even in an age of fast thrills and constant noise, her slow, deliberate storytelling still feels magnetic. She taught the world that suspense doesn't need violence, only patience and observation. Literary scholars often describe her work as an architecture of reason. Every novel she wrote followed invisible patterns, structure, rhythm, revelation. Yet what truly made her work eternal was her empathy. Beneath every corpse and clue, there was always a soft human heartbeat. Regret, jealousy, loneliness, love. Her characters weren't monsters. They were people who made one wrong choice too many. She had the rare gift of understanding sin without condemning it. Everyone, she once said, is capable of anything. That's what makes life so interesting. The more one reads her, the more one sees her quiet rebellion. In a world that often dismissed women's voices, she built her empire word by word, with no need for loudness. She was practical, disciplined, endlessly curious. Her heroines, from Miss Marple to the clever women who appear briefly in her short stories, were not beautiful or dramatic. They were observant. They noticed what others missed. And that, for Agatha, was the essence of power, to see clearly and still remain kind. Over time, researchers have studied her habits with almost forensic fascination. They've traced her daily schedules, her choice of typewriter, her travel routes, even her grocery lists. Yet the more they uncover, the more mysterious she seems. Her notebooks, over 70 of them, reveal endless ideas, character names, half-written endings. They show a mind always at work, restless and methodical. But nowhere, in all those pages, does she explain how she knew exactly what would keep millions awake at night. That secret, like one of her stories, remains unsolved. Each new generation finds something different in her work. Some admire the logic, others the comfort of justice, others the glimpses of a vanished world where civility still mattered. For many readers, opening one of her books feels like returning to order, to a place where questions have answers and truth, however painful, eventually arrives. That was her gift to humanity, reassurance through mystery. She made chaos meaningful. And so, year after year, her name continues to appear on bestseller lists. Poirot and Miss Marple are revived again and again, their faces changing with time, their souls unchanged. Somewhere, Agatha would have smiled at that, amused, perhaps, that her quiet imagination still held the world in suspense. long after her own story had reached its perfect ending. In many ways, Agatha Christie's legacy feels less like history and more like nature, something that simply exists, steady and enduring. Her novels have never gone out of print. Libraries still restock them, movie studios still adapt them, and children still find them in their parents' collections. She has become part of the cultural landscape, as inevitable as the moon or the ocean. Her books are the kind people return to when the world feels uncertain, because within her pages, no matter how chaotic the crime, there is always balance at the end. The detective story in her hands became something deeper than entertainment. It became a ritual of restoration. She once said that the joy of mystery was in the return to order, the reassurance that truth, though hidden, could always be found. And perhaps that is why her stories have survived wars, revolutions, and digital screens. They speak to the most timeless human desire, the wish to understand, to see clearly, to make sense of what seems senseless. In interviews from her later years, Agatha appeared calm but wry. When asked why her books were so successful, she would smile and say, "Because I've had a lot of practice." She distrusted theories of genius or inspiration. To her, writing was craft, something shaped through repetition, like knitting or gardening. Yet behind that modesty was quiet mastery. She had a sense for timing that no one could teach. She knew when to mislead, when to reveal, and when to let silence speak. Her influence extended far beyond literature. The logic of her stories shaped television mysteries, modern thrillers, even crime podcasts decades later. Every time a detective pauses before the final reveal, or every time the audience gasps at a hidden clue, Agatha's invisible fingerprints are there. She created the grammar of suspense itself, so seamlessly that many forget it had to be invented at all. But what makes her work more than craft is its humanity. Beneath her precision was empathy. She understood the loneliness of guilt, the ache of unspoken love, the absurd comedy of human pride. That's why her stories never age. They are not about murder, but about people. Her killers are frightened, her victims flawed, her detectives patient. She never moralized, she simply observed. "I have no message," she once said, "only curiosity." Even now, scholars continue to rediscover her, not as a puzzle maker, but as a chronicler of emotion. Her domestic settings, once dismissed as quaint, are now recognized as psychological laboratories. In the drawing rooms and country houses of her fiction, she dissected the human heart with scalpel-like grace. And through it all, she never raised her voice. She whispered, and the world listened. What continues to fascinate readers most about Agatha Christie is how quietly she lived while her imagination roamed through crime. She never courted scandal, never spoke of politics, and avoided publicity whenever she could. Her fame was immense, yet she walked through it unseen, like a shadow in her own story. Friends said she was warm but reserved, curious but discreet. She preferred small talk about gardens and travel to any discussion of writing. "I never know what to say about my books," she once admitted, "except that I enjoyed writing them." That simplicity became part of her charm, a genius hidden in plain sight. Behind that calm exterior, however, was extraordinary discipline. Agatha wrote almost every morning, no matter where she was, in a tent, on a train, at a seaside inn. She once calculated that she had written more than 10,000 pages by hand before ever owning a typewriter. Her methods were old-fashioned, yet astonishingly effective. She outlined her plots on paper scraps, rearranged them endlessly, and refused to begin a book until she knew the ending. Her sense of structure bordered on mathematical. She loved balance, symmetry, and inevitability, qualities that made her stories satisfying even decades later. She also understood rhythm, not only in language, but in tension. Each of her novels rose and fell like music, alternating between curiosity and calm. The murder was never the point. It was simply the disruption that revealed who people truly were. "I don't write about death," she said once. "I write about truth being found." That distinction separated her from imitators who focused on shock instead of resolution. Agatha believed that art should restore, not destroy. Despite her legendary precision, she never took herself too seriously. Friends recalled her laughter, often at her own forgetfulness. She misplaced keys, mismatched socks, and once left an entire suitcase on a train. When admirers spoke to her about her brilliance, she seemed genuinely puzzled. "I'm just nosy," she would say with a smile. Her humility disarmed everyone. Even at the height of fame, she remained an observer, still more interested in others than in herself. Her shyness sometimes made public appearances uncomfortable. At book signings, she wrote quickly, almost nervously, as if hoping not to be noticed too much. When fans tried to tell her how much her work meant to them, she would thank them quietly and look relieved when they left. Yet at home, among family and close friends, she was playful, fond of card games, silly jokes, and late-night storytelling by firelight. Perhaps that was her greatest secret. She never lost her ordinary humanity. The woman who wrote of murder was at heart gentle and domestic, happiest when surrounded by warmth and tea and laughter. It was this paradox, the softness behind the darkness, that made her so deeply beloved. Agatha's relationship with fame remained as peculiar as her relationship with mystery itself. She often seemed unaware of her own scale. While her novel sold hundreds of millions of copies, she continued to clip coupons, reuse paper, and fret about household bills. Money to her was never the point. Independence was. She valued the freedom to live quietly, to choose her own pace, to spend mornings at her desk and afternoons in the garden. That modest rhythm gave her stories their soul. They were written not from ambition, but from observation, a daily ritual of looking closely at life and finding patterns in its disorder. Her sense of success was personal, almost private. When asked what moment had made her feel she had arrived, she couldn't recall any. "I never felt it," she said. "I simply kept writing." There was no single triumph, only the slow accumulation of work. Her victories were invisible, a sentence that finally sounded right, a plot twist that clicked perfectly into place, the quiet relief of finishing another manuscript. In that way, she lived like one of her detectives, finding satisfaction in the details, not the applause. Even as she became a public figure, she resisted being defined. Journalists called her the Queen of Crime, a title she accepted politely but without enthusiasm. "It sounds rather sinister," she laughed. She saw herself not as a master of death, but as a student of people. Murder in her stories was only a lens through which to study character. The act itself never fascinated her. The motive did. Why someone would cross that final line was the puzzle that kept her writing for more than half a century. Her independence also extended to her artistic instincts. Publishers occasionally pushed her for more predictable endings or fashionable topics, but she refused. "Readers don't know what they want until they have it," she would say gently. She trusted her intuition, which rarely failed her. That quiet confidence came from years of patient work, of listening to her own rhythm instead of the noise around her. Through all this, Agatha remained deeply English, not in nationalism, but in temperament. She loved understatement, civility, and order. Her landscapes were filled with hedgerows, trains, and afternoon teas, scenes that to outsiders seemed idyllic, but to her were simply familiar. Yet within those ordinary settings she revealed the complexity of the human soul. That was her true gift. She took the smallest world possible and filled it with infinite depth. By the end of her life, she'd shown that genius could be quiet, and that art could be both kind and sharp at once. She made readers feel safe even as she led them into darkness, and that rare balance became her signature, the still heartbeat beneath every mystery she ever told. One of the quiet marvels of Agatha Christie's genius was how she used time. Her career spanned more than half a century, and yet her stories never felt trapped by any single era. Whether set in drawing rooms lit by oil lamps or on trains roaring through modern Europe, they carried the same pulse, that timeless curiosity about what people hide from one another. She understood, better than most, that the surface of society might change, but its heart rarely does. Envy, fear, pride, love. Those remained her raw materials, constant and inexhaustible. The subtlety of her writing was often overlooked. She rarely described emotions directly. She let them reveal themselves through small gestures. A hesitation before answering, a cup placed too carefully on a saucer, a silence that lasted one beat too long. These details spoke louder than speeches. She wrote as though she trusted her readers completely, expecting them to notice what others might miss. That trust created a partnership between writer and reader, one that has endured through generations. In the 1940s and 50s, when psychological thrillers began to dominate, Agatha's restraint became her rebellion. She never raised her voice to compete. She simply refined her art. Her villains were not maniacs, but ordinary people whose reasoning had slipped quietly out of balance. "There is a thin line," she once said, "between imagination and action." In exploring that line, she made every reader face their own capacity for darkness, but gently, never cruelly. Her craft was built on listening. At dinner parties or train rides, she observed others with calm interest, not judging, simply collecting. Later, at home, she would transform those impressions into characters. A nervous laugh might become a suspect's telltale habit. A passing remark might evolve into the key to a motive. She found inspiration not in the extraordinary, but in the everyday. The truth, she believed, was always hiding in plain sight. Over time, her precision became legendary. Even fellow writers were baffled by how seamlessly her plots fit together. She began every story with a crime solution, then worked backward to construct the illusion of mystery. It was architecture disguised as art. Yet despite the structure, her tone remained natural, even comforting. She guided readers through deception, as one might guide a child through a dark hallway, assuring them that light waited at the end. That promise, that sense of safety amid danger, may explain her lasting appeal. In a century marked by war and change, Agatha offered something steady. Her worlds were orderly even when they contained death. Justice might be delayed, but it always arrived. And in a time when reality often refused closure, she gave millions of people exactly what they needed: the quiet relief of resolution. Agatha Christie's love for archaeology was not just a chapter in her life. It was another language through which she understood existence. The years she spent beside Max Mallowan in the deserts of Syria and Iraq gave her stories a new kind of depth. She often said that digging into ancient soil felt very much like writing a mystery. Both required patience, precision, and faith that beneath layers of dust, something meaningful waited to be uncovered. Watching Max's team brush away centuries of sand to reveal a small fragment of pottery, she felt the same quiet satisfaction as when a plot twist finally made sense. Life on archaeological digs was far from glamorous. The tents were hot by day and cold by night. Flies were constant companions and meals were simple, often cooked over makeshift fires. Yet Agatha thrived there. She learned to wash fragile artifacts in cold water and used her own face cream to clean delicate ivory carvings. "I am the only writer in the world," she once joked, "who cleans sculptures with Pond's cold cream." That line, both funny and true, captured her adaptability. A woman equally at home among London's publishers and the windswept ruins of Mesopotamia. When she wasn't assisting the team, she wrote, her typewriter clattered through the dry air as local workers sifted soil nearby. Many of her greatest novels were born from those days: Murder in Mesopotamia, Death on the Nile, Appointment with Death. The desert gave her a backdrop that matched her inner calm, vast, timeless, and quietly mysterious. She loved the way time stretched there, how the sky turned gold at dusk, how silence itself seemed ancient. It reminded her that human stories, even of crime and sorrow, were brief flashes in a much older world. The locals often adored her. She treated everyone with respect, learning bits of Arabic and laughing easily with the crew. To them, she wasn't a famous writer, just Madame Agatha, the polite Englishwoman who drank tea in the shade and wrote for hours. Her humility bridged worlds. Max once said that the workmen, who barely knew how famous she was, trusted her more than many archaeologists they had met before. Those journeys also deepened her marriage. She and Max were opposites in many ways. She older and reserved, he young and analytical. Yet together they created harmony. She brought warmth and patience to his discipline. He gave her stability and admiration. When she later wrote her memoir, Come Tell Me How You Live, it wasn't a book of discoveries, but of affection, a portrait of two people quietly in love with both history and each other. Through archaeology, Agatha found balance between the past and the present. She saw in every fragment of pottery the same truth she found in her characters, that nothing is truly lost, only hidden, waiting to be understood. And just like her excavations, her stories would remain buried in readers' minds, waiting to be rediscovered generation after generation. Though Agatha Christie is remembered as the best-selling novelist of all time, what made her greatness unique was her quiet refusal to chase it. She never wrote to impress, and she never competed. She wrote because it gave her peace. In a century of loud movements and manifestos, she built her legacy through discipline and gentleness. Her days followed a rhythm as predictable as a clock. Tea at 4, a walk in the garden, letters answered before dusk. One must have order in life, she once said, so that one may have chaos in art. That sentence could have been her personal creed. The secret of her productivity, she often explained, was not inspiration but consistency. She treated writing like tending a garden, patiently, season by season, regardless of weather. Her routine rarely changed. She drafted longhand first, then typed, often editing as she went. The simplicity of her methods contrasted sharply with the complexity of her plots. Each story began with a single question, usually what if, and unfolded from there like a spiral. What if a man were found dead in a locked room? What if a letter arrived too late? What if everyone had a reason to lie? The magic lay not in the question, but in the answer that waited quietly at the end. Agatha's self-discipline came not from ambition but from temperament. She disliked idle days, believing that the mind must stay occupied to remain peaceful. Even on holiday she carried notebooks, scribbling ideas between meals. Her daughter Rosalind recalled how calmly her mother wrote, without drama, without doubt. She would simply go into her room, shut the door, and come out hours later with a chapter finished. That steady focus allowed her to produce over 80 novels, countless short stories and 16 plays, most of them still in print today. Her genius also came from listening rather than speaking. She once said she preferred eavesdropping on strangers to attending literary events. Ordinary conversations fascinated her. The way people exaggerated, concealed, or contradicted themselves without realizing. You can learn everything about someone, she said, if you listen to what they try not to say. That observation shaped her entire art. The smallest details, a glance, a hesitation, a misplaced word, became clues. Her fiction was not fantasy, but a mirror held up to real life, where everyone has secrets and truth is never loud. Yet despite her success, she remained profoundly modest. She never owned an office, never hired assistants, never dictated to typists. Her workspace was usually a small desk by a window, sometimes shared with stacks of laundry or her cat asleep on a pile of paper. The world called her a genius, but she saw herself simply as a working woman with good manners and endless curiosity. And perhaps that humility, more than anything else, is what made her stories feel so human. Mysteries written not from a pedestal, but from the quiet corner of an ordinary life, One of the most remarkable qualities of Agatha Christie's imagination was its ability to evolve while remaining utterly her own. From the 1920s to the 1970s, her settings changed. From English manors to foreign trains, from Nile steamers to sleepy villages, yet her tone stayed constant. Calm, observant, quietly curious. She had an instinct for adjusting to her era without ever surrendering her essence. When technology, war, and social values transformed Britain, Agatha simply absorbed those changes into her world. Telephones appeared, cars replaced carriages, but her mysteries remained rooted in the same truth. Human emotion is timeless. People are much the same everywhere, she wrote, only their hats are different. That timelessness was not accidental. Agatha believed that the mystery story was less about crime than about consequence. Each novel began with imbalance, a life disrupted, a secret exposed, and ended with order restored. Her readers might travel through jealousy, deceit, and death, but they always returned safely to clarity. In a world shaken by war and uncertainty, her fiction offered reassurance that truth could still triumph and that reason could still make sense of chaos. This balance between logic and emotion became her invisible signature. She often compared writing to performing surgery on human behaviour. Her characters, though fictional, were drawn from reality with startling precision. She captured the nervousness of gossiping neighbours, the quiet arrogance of the upper class, the exhaustion of servants, the self-deception of lovers. Even her villains felt believable, rarely monstrous, often sympathetic. A jealous wife, a desperate heir, a lonely doctor, ordinary people pushed beyond their limits. "I never thought of murderers as villains," she said once, "only as human beings in trouble." That gentle empathy kept her stories from cruelty and gave them enduring warmth. Agatha also understood the mathematics of surprise. She once described her method as planting flowers that later turn out to be traps. Every line mattered. A detail mentioned casually in Chapter 3 would explode with significance in Chapter 20. Yet despite the intricate structure, her writing never felt mechanical. It flowed naturally with the grace of someone who trusted rhythm more than reason. Her endings shocked not because they were unbelievable, but because they were inevitable, the truth hiding in plain sight all along. As she grew older, critics sometimes underestimated her simplicity, calling her style old-fashioned. She smiled at that. She never chased fashion. She wrote for clarity. Her goal was not to impress, but to communicate. She often said she wanted her books to be read on a rainy afternoon with comfort and curiosity. And that is exactly how they continue to be read, quietly, by millions of people seeking that rare feeling her work always provided. The comfort of knowing that even in a world of secrets, truth still waits to be found. Agatha Christie's relationship with her two most famous creations, Hercule Poirot and Miss Marple, was complex and fascinating, almost like that of a parent with two very different children. Poirot came first, born from her experiences during the First World War and inspired by Belgian refugees she met while working as a nurse. He was precise, proud, meticulous, and endlessly organised. His obsession with order and symmetry reflected a part of Agatha herself, the part that found comfort in control. She once admitted that she had given Poirot her own fastidious habits, his dislike of untidiness, his respect for logic, and his love of small details. Yet as he grew famous, she sometimes found him exhausting. "He is an egocentric little man," she wrote in her diary, "but the public adores him, so I must put up with him." Miss Marple, on the other hand, arrived later and felt like a breath of fresh air. She was older, wiser, and less theatrical. Where Poirot approached crime with geometry and flair, Marple approached it with empathy. Her method was observation, comparing new people to those she had known all her life in her village of St. Mary Mead. "Human nature," she would say, "is the same everywhere." Through Miss Marple, Agatha expressed a more reflective view of life, one that came with age and gentleness. She admired the old lady's insight but never idealised her. Marple was sharp, sometimes even ruthless in her conclusions, yet always wrapped in warmth and lace. The two detectives represented the duality within Agatha herself. Poirot embodied her intellect, Marple her wisdom. Through them, she explored the two halves of mystery, the logical and the emotional, the masculine and the feminine, the public and the private. She once joked that if the two ever met, they would instantly dislike each other, and perhaps she was right. Yet both became timeless symbols of reason and intuition, two forces she believed every human being carried within. Over the decades, she grew more attached to Marple's quiet world. The small village, the gossip, the deceptive tranquillity, they reminded her of her own childhood in Devon, where secrets lived behind polite smiles. Through Marple, she returned to that landscape again and again, examining it like an archaeologist of manners. It was her way of capturing England's soul before modern life erased it. When she finally decided to say goodbye to her detectives, she did it with care and ceremony. Poirot's final case, Curtain, written during the Second World War but published only after her death, ended his story with grace and inevitability. Miss Marple, too, received her farewell in Sleeping Murder, a book that tied her lifelong themes together: memory, time, and the quiet persistence of truth. In her own way, Agatha gave them both immortality. Through Poirot and Marple, she ensured that somewhere, in some quiet corner of fiction, the world's most curious minds would forever continue their patient search for the truth, one puzzle, one heartbeat at a time. One of the most misunderstood aspects of Agatha Christie's legacy is her subtle understanding of psychology. Long before thrillers explored trauma and motive in clinical terms, she was already mapping the human mind with remarkable precision, but she did it quietly, without the language of science. Her insight came from observation, not theory. She noticed how guilt changed posture, how lies softened voices, how grief disguised itself as irritation. Her detectives rarely relied on fingerprints or forensics. They relied on human behaviour. For Agatha, every crime began as an emotional imbalance, jealousy disguised as virtue, resentment dressed as love. It's never the obvious reason, she once said, because people rarely understand why they do things. Critics often underestimated that psychological depth, mistaking her calm tone for simplicity. Yet readers felt its power instinctively. Beneath the comfort of her country houses and orderly villages was a quiet unease, a reminder that evil can hide inside kindness, and that truth, once revealed, changes everything. In her world, murder was never just about death. It was about exposure. Once the mask slipped, life could never return to what it was before. This quiet tension between stability and revelation gave her work its haunting elegance. Her empathy for the human condition came from personal experience. She had known fear during war, heartbreak in her first marriage, and exhaustion from years of writing. Yet she never turned cynical. Her stories carried moral clarity without moralizing. Wrongdoers faced justice, but their motives were always treated with understanding. She saw sin as a form of confusion, the result of emotions that had grown too heavy to bear. That perspective made her mysteries strangely compassionate. They did not punish the reader with darkness, they illuminated it. Agatha's interest in psychology also extended to memory and perception. She loved to play with unreliable witnesses, half-remembered events, and the way emotion distorts truth. What we think we saw, she wrote, is rarely what happened. That insight, decades ahead of its time, later influenced modern writers who built entire genres around it. Yet Agatha used it not to shock, but to reveal something deeply human, how fragile our understanding of reality really is. Some scholars later described her fiction as gentle existentialism. Behind the charm and teacups lay profound questions. What is truth? What do we owe each other? Can justice ever heal what's broken? She never answered directly. She preferred suggestion to statement, allowing readers to decide for themselves. That restraint gave her work depth that continues to resonate. By exploring darkness with empathy, she achieved what few writers ever have. She made the study of crime an act of grace. To read her is not merely to solve a puzzle, but to glimpse the delicate machinery of the soul. And that, perhaps more than any clever twist, is why her stories still feel alive. Reminders that understanding, even of the worst in us, is a form of light. Agatha Christie's voice, though gentle, carried across continents. By the mid-20th century, she had become a universal language of storytelling. Her books appeared in nearly every major tongue, translated with astonishing speed and precision. In Japan, readers adored her logic. In South America, her elegance. In Europe, her quiet irony. Her detectives became cultural ambassadors. Poirot, the meticulous European mind. Miss Marple, the wise English heart. Together they embodied values that transcended borders, observation, patience, and the faith that truth could still be found in a noisy world. She proved that mystery at its core was not about place or culture, but about people. What surprised her most was that her humour survived translation. She never considered herself funny, yet her dry wit, that subtle English understatement, resonated worldwide. A raised eyebrow from Poirot or a village gossip's well-timed remark made readers smile in every language. Humour, she believed, was part of the puzzle. Laughter, she once said, is the small breath you take before realising something dreadful. It was her way of balancing light and shadow, ensuring that even at its darkest her fiction never lost its human warmth. Her global fame brought odd experiences. She received letters from fans who claimed to have solved real-life crimes after reading her books, and once a detective from Argentina wrote to thank her for teaching him patience. She found these stories both flattering and absurd, insisting she knew nothing of actual policing. "I make patterns," she replied, "not arrests." Her humility only deepened her legend, a woman who ruled the world of crime fiction without ever leaving her writing chair. Publishers around the world courted her relentlessly. Film studios adapted Murder on the Orient Express, Death on the Nile, and Evil Under the Sun, transforming her work into spectacles filled with stars. Agatha tolerated the glamour but cared little for it. She attended premieres rarely, often slipping away before the applause. To her, cinema was an interesting echo of her craft, but not its equal. "A book," she said softly, "allows the reader to imagine. A film imagines for you." Despite all the attention, she remained grounded in her private rituals. Each time she finished a manuscript, she rewarded herself not with champagne, but with a new notebook, a blank promise of another story waiting to unfold. She kept dozens of them stacked neatly, filled with scrawled outlines, half-formed ideas, and questions that might someday bloom into mysteries. Some were never used, left deliberately incomplete, as if she preferred that certain enigmas remain unsolved. Through this quiet rhythm she built a bridge between solitude and the world. While fame surrounded her, she stayed rooted in silence. And in that silence she gave generations of readers something extraordinary. A sense of belonging inside mystery itself, where suspense could be kind, logic could comfort, and curiosity could feel like home. One of the most beautiful contradictions in Agatha Christie's life was that she, who wrote endlessly about death, was so profoundly devoted to life. She loved simple pleasures, music, flowers, travel, and the company of good-humoured people. In her letters she often described the smell of lilacs in spring, the satisfaction of baking scones, or the sound of rain against a window while she worked. For someone whose imagination wandered through murder and deceit, her daily existence was full of gratitude. She believed joy was found in order, in caring for small things. "A clean desk and a full teapot," she once said, "and one can face anything." That quiet philosophy sustained her through every storm. Her optimism, however, was never naive. She understood the fragility of peace. Having lived through 2 world wars, she knew how quickly the familiar could vanish. That awareness gave her writing a subtle melancholy. Even in her cosiest mysteries, there was always the echo of loss, the sense that beneath the calm of an English afternoon, something darker stirred. Yet she never allowed despair to dominate. Instead, she turned it into compassion. Her characters, even the guilty, were rarely beyond redemption. She believed that wrongdoing came from pain, not evil. That belief made her stories unexpectedly tender, offering understanding rather than condemnation. She also cherished humour as a shield. When asked how she could spend her life writing about murder, she laughed, "Because I prefer to keep it on paper." She treated darkness like an equation, something to be solved, not feared. In interviews, she often seemed amused by her own fame, deflecting serious questions with wit. "I don't think of myself as mysterious," she once said. "I'm really rather dull." That modesty disarmed even the most sceptical journalists. They found it hard to believe that the quiet woman before them had created some of literature's most intricate puzzles. Despite her renown, she remained surprisingly shy. Crowds made her nervous, and she disliked being photographed. She preferred the anonymity of being a face in a crowd, unnoticed, free to observe. That invisibility was her secret weapon. It allowed her to study people naturally, the way they spoke, hesitated, or pretended. She gathered these fragments silently, later weaving them into her plots. "Writers," she said, "are magpies. We steal shiny bits of life and make them our own." As her fame grew, invitations poured in from universities, book fairs, and royal events, but she declined most of them. She was polite, never arrogant, simply uninterested in spectacle. She once explained that she valued the mystery of the writer more than their personality. "Once people know too much about you," she said, "they stop hearing your stories." It was a rare kind of wisdom in a world already obsessed with celebrity. Agatha Christie lived quietly, but her calmness was not retreat. It was mastery. She had found what most artists spend a lifetime searching for, a way to create without noise, to exist fully in stillness, and to let her work speak long after she was gone. The longer one studies Agatha Christie's life, the clearer it becomes that her genius was inseparable from her silence. She moved through the world like a listener in a crowded room, collecting tones, fragments, gestures. People who met her often remarked that she spoke softly and smiled easily, but that her eyes missed nothing. She could describe a stranger's nervous habits after only a few minutes. What others overlooked, she noticed instinctively, a habit that gave her fiction its uncanny realism. "I suppose I'm a watcher," she once said. "I look, and then I imagine." Watching for her was both profession and refuge. Her upbringing had prepared her for that quiet attentiveness. As a child in Torquay, she had spent long days alone, reading, exploring the garden, and inventing conversations between imaginary friends. Solitude never frightened her. It nourished her. That same stillness followed her through adulthood. Even as her fame grew, she maintained an inward life untouched by the noise of success. Visitors to Greenway often found her sitting by a window with a notebook, content simply to observe the changing light on the river. She needed no audience to feel alive, only curiosity. The discipline of her imagination fascinated psychologists for decades. Some scholars tried to explain her creativity through intellect, others through routine. But perhaps the answer was simpler. She loved puzzles because they reflected how she saw the world. Life, to her, was full of incomplete patterns, fragments of conversation, half-truths, coincidences. Writing allowed her to bring those fragments together until they made sense. Each novel was a small act of restoration, an attempt to prove that order was still possible. In a century that had known 2 wars, that idea comforted millions. Yet Agatha never pretended to possess wisdom beyond storytelling. When readers called her a philosopher, she laughed. "I'm only good at asking questions," she said. I leave the answers to others. That humility gave her writing an almost spiritual balance, firm but never didactic, sharp but never cruel. Her detectives did not force justice. They revealed it, like archaeologists brushing dust from a buried truth. The act of discovery, not punishment, was what mattered. Despite her insistence on privacy, she occasionally appeared at literary gatherings. Those who expected a commanding presence were surprised. She was short, graceful, unassuming. Not the image of a literary giant, but of a neighbour one might chat with over tea. Yet the moment she spoke, her calm authority filled the room. Listeners described her voice as musical, deliberate, and full of quiet humour. She never dramatized herself, never sought applause. When asked the secret to her success, she replied, "I listen to people, and then I tell them what they already know, only differently." It was the simplest explanation for the most intricate art. Looking back, one sees that Agatha's greatness lay not in grand gestures, but in her devotion to subtlety. She believed mystery was not about confusion, but about clarity, the slow unveiling of what has always been there. And in that belief, she built not just stories, but a mirror for the human soul, one that still reflects us with startling honesty today. By the time the 1960s arrived, Agatha Christie had already become a cultural monument, admired, studied, and endlessly imitated. But she herself remained curiously detached from the idea of legacy. She wrote because she always had, not because history demanded it. "One must write," she once said, "as one breathes, without thinking about it too much." That practicality defined her entire career. She never waited for inspiration, never indulged in creative crisis. To her, imagination was not a storm but a current, steady, continuous, and quietly powerful. She simply followed where it led. Her daily routine during these later years was almost sacred in its simplicity. Breakfast with Max, a few letters answered by hand, a walk outside to inspect the flowers, then hours of writing before lunch. She preferred working in silence, the kind broken only by the ticking of clocks or the scratch of her pen. In the afternoons, she read newspapers, marking curious headlines for future plots. Evenings were for family, friends, or small social gatherings. "Ordinary life," she said once, "is a writer's best education." The people she met, neighbours, gardeners, shopkeepers, all found their way into her fiction in subtle ways. Her fascination with everyday humanity kept her art alive when others grew repetitive. While some novelists tired of their own formulas, Agatha continued to find wonder in the small hypocrisies and secret kindnesses of ordinary people. She was never cruel to her characters, even when they were foolish. "People," she wrote, "do their best, even when their best is rather terrible." That compassionate irony became her hallmark. At the same time, she remained remarkably forward-thinking. She understood that times were changing, that readers were becoming sharper, less patient, and more exposed to violence in media. Instead of resisting, she adapted subtly. Her later works, such as The Pale Horse and Endless Night, were darker and more psychological, exploring fear, manipulation, and the fragility of belief. Critics were surprised by her boldness, but Agatha dismissed their surprise. "A writer should change," she said. "Otherwise the stories grow tired before the writer does." Even in her 70s, she was experimenting, learning, and refining her craft. Yet for all her success, she remained humble in ways that bordered on disbelief. When told she was the most published author in the world after Shakespeare and the Bible, she laughed. "Surely there's been some mistake," she replied. To her, fame was an abstraction, something that belonged to her books, not to her. She saw herself as a tradeswoman of words, someone who made things carefully like a tailor or a baker, and perhaps that attitude explains why her work endures. She never chased immortality, she simply built it one page at a time. By the close of the decade, she had written nearly 70 novels, translated into more than 100 languages. Her plays continued to run to full houses, and her detectives were beloved across generations. Yet in the midst of global admiration, Agatha Christie remained the same quiet observer she had always been, a woman who found meaning not in fame, but in the peaceful rhythm of creating order out of chaos. One of the most striking things about Agatha Christie's art was how invisible her hand seemed within it. She built intricate worlds, but never drew attention to herself as their creator. The writing was so clean, so effortless, that readers often forgot someone had built the architecture behind it. "The best style," she once said, "is the one that leaves no fingerprints." That modesty was both artistic and moral. She believed that the story should belong entirely to the reader, that once the book was opened, the author should quietly step aside and let imagination do the rest. In that way, she gave her audience a rare gift: freedom inside fiction. Her invisibility was deceptive, though, for her technical mastery was extraordinary. Every clue, every misdirection, every rhythm of dialogue was placed with precision. She had an intuitive understanding of timing, of how long a reader would take to turn a page, of when curiosity would peak, of how to delay revelation by just a breath. The skill looked simple only because she had practiced it for decades. Like a pianist who makes music sound effortless, she concealed the labour behind ease. "Plotting," she once joked, "is like embroidery. You hide the knots." What she valued most was clarity. Her sentences were never ornamental. They were built to carry emotion without calling attention to themselves. The simplicity of her language allowed complexity to live beneath it. She trusted the reader's intelligence, a decision that made her books accessible to everyone, from teenagers to scholars. In that trust lay her genius. She treated readers not as customers to be entertained, but as partners in thought. Each mystery became a conversation between equals, bound by curiosity. This clarity extended beyond style to worldview. Agatha believed deeply in reason, not the cold intellect of calculation, but the quiet faith that things could make sense. Her detectives reflected that belief. They listened, questioned, and most importantly noticed. In their world, logic was not opposed to empathy. It was its companion. To understand why someone lied or killed, one had to first understand their pain. That union of intelligence and compassion was rare then, and it remains rare now. Agatha often said she admired kindness above all else. It was, in her opinion, the truest sign of intelligence. "Cleverness without kindness," she wrote, "is like a light without warmth." That conviction ran through all her work, shaping even her darkest tales. She never glorified cruelty or chaos. Her murders were puzzles, not spectacles, and her resolutions were about restoration, not revenge. It was this moral steadiness, quiet, consistent, deeply human, that made her stories so enduring. They reminded readers that goodness, however fragile, could still prevail. In the end, what separated Agatha Christie from her imitators was not her cleverness, but her grace. She understood that mystery, like life, was not about endless shocks, but about the beauty of revelation, the gentle turning of darkness into light. And in a world that often celebrated noise, she built her legacy through silence, an artist who whispered, and whose whisper still echoes through every page she ever wrote. When readers today open one of Agatha Christie's novels, they step not only into a mystery, but into a world built with absolute confidence in the power of thought. Her fiction invites the mind to slow down, to notice, to connect fragments. That experience is timeless. Generations separated by language, culture, or technology still share the same small thrill when the final page turns and everything, at last, makes sense. It is not the revelation of who committed the crime that matters most, but the quiet satisfaction of order restored. That fragile, beautiful feeling that life, even in its chaos, can be understood. Agatha offered that to millions who lived through war, loss, and change. Her novels became more than entertainment. They became emotional architecture. What made her understanding of order profound was that she never confused it with perfection. She knew that life was messy, unpredictable, and unfair. Yet within that imperfection, she searched for patterns, for the tiny truths that made survival possible. She often said she believed in the essential decency of people, even when they lied or faltered. Most people, she wrote, mean well, even when they go wrong. That mercy flowed through her characters. It softened the edges of her fiction, turning what might have been grim into something deeply human. In her hands, crime became not destruction but inquiry, a way of asking why pain exists and how we live with it. She once compared her process to untangling a necklace: patient work, careful fingers, and the occasional flash of intuition. The metaphor fits her perfectly. Every book she wrote was an act of untangling, not just of a fictional puzzle, but of the human heart. And when the knots were finally undone, she offered readers a small, shining truth: that clarity, though temporary, was still worth seeking. In her later interviews, when asked how she felt about the vast reach of her work, she seemed amused. "I never expected it to last," she said. "I only hoped people would enjoy it for a little while." That understatement has aged into quiet irony. A little while became forever. Her stories have survived fashions, revolutions, and entire shifts in how people read. Long after her time, they remain vivid, fresh, alive. Proof that clarity never goes out of style. In classrooms, her books are used to teach logic. In hospitals, they are read for comfort. On long journeys, they serve as companions. Something in them makes solitude gentler. Perhaps it is her calm tone, or the assurance that no mystery is unsolvable. Even the darkest secrets, she reminds us, can yield to patience and attention. That message, more than any twist or murder, is her true inheritance to the world. She turned reasoning into empathy, deduction into hope. Every reader who closes one of her books carries a little of that hope forward, the belief that understanding, however fragile, is still possible. And that is why Agatha Christie endures, not because she solved mysteries, but because she helped us face our own with grace. Agatha Christie's presence in modern culture is so vast that it sometimes feels invisible, like air or language itself. Her influence has seeped into every corner of storytelling: novels, films, television, theatre, even video games. Every locked room mystery, every dinner table confession, every detective who gathers suspects for a final revelation owes something to her quiet imagination. Writers who may never have read her directly still echo her patterns unconsciously. She didn't just shape a genre, she defined its grammar. Before her, the detective story was a clever pastime. After her, it became an art form. What is most striking about this legacy is that it was built without arrogance or self-promotion. Agatha never saw herself as revolutionary. She believed she was simply doing what she enjoyed, thinking of impossible things and making them possible on paper. That modesty gave her work an honesty that still feels rare. There was no posturing in her success, no myth of the tortured artist. She wrote steadily, kindly, and without pretension. She treated storytelling as both craft and comfort, something human and useful, like cooking or gardening. Perhaps that is why her books feel so alive even now. They were made with the same quiet love one puts into daily rituals. Over time, her name became shorthand for trust. To pick up a Christie novel is to know you will be guided carefully through confusion toward clarity. No matter how tangled the clues, you are never abandoned. That bond between author and reader, that invisible promise, is what made her immortal. Her mysteries are not about deception, but about faith. Faith that truth exists, that reason can uncover it, that even in darkness there is structure and meaning. In an uncertain century, that message became a form of solace. As culture grew noisier, her restraint became even more powerful. While modern thrillers exploded with violence and spectacle, her calm logic endured. Readers continue to turn to her for balance, a reminder that intelligence need not be cold and morality need not be loud. She proved that gentleness could be thrilling, that a whisper could carry more weight than a scream. This quiet defiance made her revolutionary in her own understated way. Today, her novels still sell in the hundreds of millions. Adaptations continue to appear, some faithful, others bold reimaginings. Yet through every reinvention, her spirit remains intact. The details may change, new actors, modern settings, but the essence never does. The careful dance between suspicion and revelation, between fear and understanding. Her stories remind us that mystery is not an escape from life, but a way of seeing it more clearly. To encounter Agatha Christie now is to meet not just a writer, but a philosophy, one that believes in order, empathy, and the slow triumph of truth. And in a world still filled with noise and uncertainty, that philosophy feels more necessary than ever. As time passes, Agatha Christie's work continues to reveal new layers, as if her stories were living organisms that adapt to each generation that reads them. Modern readers often approach her novels for nostalgia, the charm of English villages, the elegance of trains and tea sets, yet they quickly discover something more profound beneath the surface. Her fiction, stripped of its period details, is a mirror for timeless human behaviour. Pride, envy, fear, longing. These are her real subjects, wrapped in puzzles that never age. That is why her stories still feel current, because the motives behind crime are the same now as they were a century ago. She was not documenting an era. She was describing the species. Critics have tried for decades to explain the endurance of her appeal. Some point to her mastery of structure, others to her subtle humour or moral balance. But perhaps the truest reason lies in her understanding of rhythm, the almost musical pacing of her plots. Each book follows a pulse that feels instinctively human. The rise of curiosity, the moment of confusion, the tightening of suspense, and finally the relief of comprehension. Reading her is like listening to a symphony that ends in resolution. That rhythm touches something ancient in the mind, the desire to know, and the peace that comes when knowledge arrives. Agatha herself would have laughed at such analysis. She never claimed philosophy or artistry. She claimed only persistence. "I just write what I can," she said. "If people like it, that's luck." Yet luck alone cannot explain the billions of copies sold, or the fact that her works are second only to the Bible and Shakespeare in publication. What she built was not an empire of fame, but of trust. She offered readers a dependable refuge, a place where questions always lead somewhere, and where logic eventually untangles emotion. Her books became small sanctuaries of reason in an unreasonable world. There is another aspect to her power: comfort. Beneath all the suspense, her stories carry a strange gentleness, an almost maternal reassurance that chaos can be tidied, that truth, though buried, will always surface. That feeling keeps her readers loyal for life. Many who first discover her as children return decades later, finding new wisdom in the same pages. Her writing grows with you. Light entertainment at 16, quiet philosophy at 60. Few authors achieve that. When she died in 1976, some predicted her popularity would fade, that her polite mysteries would be replaced by something grittier. But the opposite happened. In a faster, harsher world, her calm precision only grew more precious. She remains a reminder of what storytelling can do at its best, not simply to distract, but to heal. Through her logic, she restored faith in understanding. Through her empathy, she restored faith in humanity. And so, every time a reader opens one of her books, Agatha Christie breathes again, quietly, gracefully, endlessly solving the mystery of why we read at all. To speak of Agatha Christie today is to speak of a paradox, a woman who lived without noise yet whose voice still fills the world. Nearly half a century after her passing, her books continue to outsell those of entire generations of writers. Her detectives, born from quiet observation in an English sitting room, are now global icons. They live on in countless languages, radio plays, stage productions, and films, And yet, beneath all that grandeur, her essence remains profoundly modest. She never sought to be extraordinary. She sought to be precise. She didn't want to shock. She wanted to understand. And in that humility lies her immortality. Her fiction endures because it satisfies a hunger that technology, progress, and modernity have never erased: the desire for meaning. In her worlds, no event is senseless, no action without motive, no detail without purpose. The world outside may be chaotic, but inside a Christie novel, reason always returns. Each mystery is a miniature universe governed by justice, balance, and moral logic. That reassurance, subtle but powerful, continues to draw readers back when life feels uncertain. She gave us something few authors ever manage: peace through curiosity. What's remarkable is how her work continues to grow rather than fade. New adaptations appear every decade, reinterpreting her stories for changing audiences, some grand and cinematic, others intimate and faithful. Yet even in modern retellings, her foundation remains untouched: a respect for intelligence, an affection for humanity, and an unwavering belief that truth, however hidden, can be found. Her simplicity withstands time better than any ornamentation could. She built her art not for fashion, but for eternity. Beyond the stories, her personal philosophy feels more relevant than ever. She believed in quiet work, in patience, in the discipline of small daily efforts. Write a little every day, she advised young writers, and it will surprise you what you can build. That advice, stripped of glamour, is the secret to her vast legacy. It reminds us that greatness rarely appears suddenly. It accumulates quietly, word by word, choice by choice. In that way, her life itself was a mystery solved, the answer being that devotion, not brilliance, creates masterpieces. Her resting place in the village of Cholsey is simple, surrounded by grass and wildflowers. Visitors often leave fresh blooms, sometimes accompanied by a note of thanks. They thank her not only for her stories, but for the calm they bring, for reminding the world that intellect and kindness can coexist, that even the darkest question can lead to light. And so, the woman who turned murder into art lives on, not in spectacle but in silence, in the hush of turning pages, in the satisfaction of a final clue, in the gentle belief that understanding is still possible. Every time a reader smiles at her last line and closes the book, the story begins again, and somewhere, quietly, Agatha Christie nods in approval.